What most people misunderstand about an empath is that their breaking point is never sudden. It's not a dramatic explosion or a single moment of weakness. It's a slow, almost invisible accumulation layer by layer, experience by experience, where emotional weight builds quietly beneath the surface. An empath doesn't react the way most people expect. When they're hurt, they don't immediately retaliate. They analyze, they rationalize, they try to understand. If someone disrespects them, they don't jump to conclusions, they look for context. Maybe they're going through something. If someone withdraws or becomes cold, the empath doesn't mirror that behavior, they lean in further. Maybe they need more support. This is where the process begins. Because what looks like patience from the outside is often internal negotiation. The empath is constantly balancing what they feel with what they believe others deserve. They override their own emotional signals in favor of preserving connection. And over time, this creates a dangerous pattern. They begin to normalize what should have been unacceptable from the start. Every time a boundary is crossed and not enforced, something subtle shifts. Not externally, but internally. The empath registers it. They feel it deeply. But instead of acting on it, they store it. They tell themselves it's not worth the conflict. They convince themselves that understanding is more important than reaction. And so they absorb it. This is the part most people never see, because the empath doesn't always express pain in obvious ways. They don't announce every disappointment. They don't catalog every betrayal out loud. But psychologically, nothing is dismissed. It's all recorded. Every inconsistency, every moment of being undervalued, every instance where their effort wasn't reciprocated. And here's where it becomes critical to understand the difference between endurance and tolerance. Endurance is conscious. It has limits. Tolerance, when stretched too far, becomes self-abandonment. The empath, without realizing it, begins crossing that line. They're no longer choosing to stay, they feel obligated to stay. Not because the situation deserves it, but because they've invested too much emotionally to walk away. So they give more. They communicate more clearly. They become more patient. They try to fix what isn't theirs to fix. And in doing so, they unintentionally teach others a very specific lesson. That access to them has no real consequences, that their forgiveness is predictable, that their presence is guaranteed. This is how the imbalance forms. Because while the empath is increasing their effort, the other person often decreases theirs. Not always out of malice, but out of adaptation. Human behavior follows patterns of reinforcement. When there's no resistance, no boundary, no loss, behavior doesn't correct itself. It escalates or becomes careless. And still, the empath stays. Not because they're weak, but because they're wired for depth. They don't connect halfway. They don't invest casually. When they choose someone, they commit psychologically, emotionally, and often even morally. Walking away doesn't feel like a simple decision, it feels like abandoning something meaningful. But here's the paradox. The more they ignore their internal signals, the louder those signals become. What was once a quiet discomfort turns into emotional fatigue. What was once patience turns into depletion. And what was once hope slowly transforms into something else, something much more dangerous: clarity. Because eventually, the empath reaches a point where the pattern becomes undeniable. Not through one event, but through repetition. They start to see that it wasn't just a bad day, or a misunderstanding, or a temporary phase. It was a consistent dynamic. And once that realization begins to form, everything they've been holding in doesn't disappear, it organizes. It aligns, it makes sense all at once. This is why their breaking point feels sudden to everyone else. Because while others were only paying attention to the present moment, the empath was carrying the entire history. So when they finally pull back, when they finally go silent, when they finally stop explaining, it's not an overreaction. It's the conclusion of a process that's been unfolding for a long time. And by the time you see the reaction, the decision has already been made internally. Because an empath doesn't break when they're hurt. They break when they realize the hurt was never going to stop. And once that realization settles in, there is no going back to who they used to be. There is a moment in the empath's journey that changes everything, but it rarely looks dramatic from the outside. It doesn't come with a warning, and it doesn't always come with conflict. In fact, it often happens in silence during a normal day, in a normal interaction when something internal finally aligns in a way that cannot be reversed. It's not that the empath suddenly becomes someone new. It's that they finally stop misinterpreting what has been happening all along. Up until this point, the empath has been operating under a kind of internal assumption that people are generally good, that effort will eventually be reciprocated, and that if they just communicate clearly enough, things will improve. This belief system is powerful because it's rooted in their nature. They don't want to see people as disposable. They don't want to reduce relationships to transactions. So they give meaning to behavior that objectively doesn't deserve it. They reinterpret inconsistency as complexity. They label emotional neglect as stress. They frame distance as temporary. And in doing so, they delay a truth their nervous system has already been registering for a long time. But the human mind has a threshold for contradiction. You can only hold so many opposing realities before something has to resolve. And for the empath, that resolution doesn't come through argument. It comes through perception. There is a shift where they stop asking, why is this happening? And start asking, why am I still explaining this to myself? That question is the beginning of the awakening. Because once an empath begins to observe without justifying, the emotional fog starts to clear. Patterns that were once emotionally softened become structurally visible. The inconsistency is no longer random, it's consistent. The effort imbalance is no longer accidental, it's repeated. The emotional confusion they once felt starts to look less like complexity and more like design. And this is where the internal fracture happens, not between them and others, but between their perception and reality. They begin to see that they were not just participating in a relationship. They were managing it, holding it together, compensating for gaps they didn't create, filling emotional spaces that someone else refused to occupy. And the most uncomfortable realization is not that they were hurt, it's that they were needed more than they were valued. This is the moment clarity begins to form, but clarity is not immediately comfortable. It doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels disorienting. Because clarity removes the emotional justification that made endurance possible. It takes away the stories that kept them loyal. It dismantles the internal narrative that said, this will get better if I just try harder. And without those stories, the empath is left with something raw. Truth without emotional cushioning. That's why this awakening often feels like emotional distance before it feels like strength. They start to withdraw internally long before they withdraw externally. Conversations that once felt engaging start to feel repetitive. Effort that once felt meaningful starts to feel one-sided. And most importantly, the emotional urgency they used to feel begins to disappear. But what's really happening is not detachment from others, it's reconnection with internal perception. For the first time, they are no longer reacting to potential. They are responding to reality. And reality has a very different emotional weight. There is also a subtle but powerful psychological shift that happens here. The empath stops trying to be understood by people who have repeatedly shown they are not willing to understand. This is not bitterness. It is efficiency. Emotional energy is no longer wasted on explanations that lead nowhere. The need to be validated by the same source that caused confusion begins to dissolve. This is where the empath becomes dangerous in a psychological sense, not to others, but to old dynamics. Because once someone stops over-explaining, over-giving, and over-adjusting, the entire structure of the relationship changes. The imbalance is no longer supported. The system loses its compensation mechanism. And that is when people notice the shift. They don't always understand it. They just feel it. The empath is still physically present, but emotionally, something has stepped back. The urgency is gone. The availability is no longer automatic. The emotional accessibility that was once assumed is now conditional. But what others experience as distance, the empath experiences as alignment. Because for the first time, they are not reacting to fear of loss, they are responding to recognition of truth. And once that recognition becomes irreversible, the empath doesn't argue anymore. They don't try to convince. They don't try to repair what was never being built equally in the first place. They simply see it. And in that seeing, the illusion ends. Because the awakening of an empath is not the moment they stop caring. It is the moment they finally understand what they were carrying all along and decide they no longer need to carry it at all. And once that realization becomes permanent, the old version of them doesn't return. When an empath finally detaches, most people misread it completely. They assume something has gone wrong. They think the empath has become cold, distant, or even emotionally unavailable in a negative sense. But what's actually happening is far more precise than that. It's not emotional shutdown, it is emotional reorganization. For a long time, the empath operates in a high engagement emotional state. They are tuned in, responsive, aware of subtle shifts in tone, behavior, and energy. They don't just hear what people say, they interpret what is behind it. That level of perception creates depth and connection, but it also creates vulnerability in environments where that depth is not reciprocated. Because when you are consistently emotionally open in a one-sided dynamic, something begins to happen internally. Your system starts overcompensating. You begin to fill gaps in communication. You begin to anticipate needs that are never expressed. You begin to maintain emotional continuity for both people in the interaction. And over time, that becomes exhausting in a way that is not immediately visible from the outside. What looks like care is actually sustained cognitive and emotional load. So when the empath reaches their limit, the shift is not loud. It's not reactive. It's not emotional chaos. It is the opposite. It is silence, but not empty silence, structured silence, conscious silence, the kind of silence that comes from a mind that has already processed more than it is willing to continue expressing. And this is where people become confused, because they are used to a version of the empath who explains, who clarifies, who softens tension, who tries to repair misunderstandings before they escalate. That version of the empath is relationally active. But once detachment begins, that entire behavioral system goes offline. Not because the empath is no longer capable of empathy, but because empathy is no longer being offered without structure. This is a critical distinction. Emotional detachment in an empath is not the absence of feeling. It is the removal of automatic emotional access. It is the shift from open-loop emotional processing to closed-loop evaluation. In simple terms, they stop reacting in real time to emotional stimuli that previously pulled them into over-involvement. And when that happens, something very noticeable emerges: calmness. But it's not the calmness of peace, it's the calmness of clarity. They are no longer internally negotiating every interaction. They are no longer translating confusion into patience. They are no longer absorbing emotional inconsistency and trying to stabilize it internally. That work stops. And when that internal work stops, their external presence changes dramatically. They become more deliberate with their words. They no longer rush to fill silence. They no longer over-explain their boundaries. They no longer feel compelled to rescue conversations from discomfort. And to those who were used to their constant emotional engagement, this feels like loss. But from the empath's perspective, it is restoration. Because for the first time, their emotional energy is no longer being spent in real time on managing other people's internal states. It is being redirected inward, into observation, into evaluation, into self-regulation without external interference. And here's what most people miss. Detachment is not withdrawal from connection. It is withdrawal from imbalance. An empath does not stop caring. They stop overcorrecting for emotional irresponsibility in others. They stop translating inconsistency into potential. They stop confusing intensity with intimacy. And once that stops, relationships that depended on emotional overfunctioning begin to destabilize. That destabilization is what others feel as distance. But in reality, nothing has been removed that shouldn't have been questioned in the first place. What has changed is that the empath is no longer compensating for emotional gaps that were never theirs to fill. This is where emotional power begins to emerge, not in dominance, not in control, but in restraint. Because restraint is what most people cannot sustain when they are emotionally triggered. They react, they pursue, they explain, they attempt to fix. The empath, in contrast, learns to observe without immediate response. And that delay, the space between stimulus and reaction, is where power develops. In that space, they regain choice. Choice over engagement, choice over explanation, choice over emotional investment. And most importantly, choice over access. This is why detached empaths are often misunderstood. People assume they have become indifferent, but indifference does not require awareness. What the empath has developed is awareness without compulsion. They still see everything. They still understand everything. But they no longer feel obligated to act on everything. And that shift changes the entire psychological dynamic between them and others. Because now emotional access is no longer guaranteed. It must be earned through consistency, respect, and reciprocity. And anything less simply does not register as worthy of emotional investment. So what appears as emotional distance is actually emotional precision. And once an empath reaches this stage, they are no longer driven by the fear of losing people. They are guided by the awareness of what it costs to keep them. And in that realization, silence is no longer a reaction. It becomes a decision. And that decision quietly ends every dynamic that was built on emotional imbalance without a single argument ever needing to happen. What follows after emotional detachment is often misunderstood as the end of the empath's story, but in reality, it's the beginning of something far more stable and intentional. Because once an empath has seen through patterns, withdrawn from imbalance, they can begin to heal and restore balance to themselves, and stopped overextending their emotional system. Something important starts to emerge underneath all of that experience: structure. Not emotional reactivity, not survival-based connection, but structure. And that structure is what we call boundaries, but not in the way people usually think about them. Most people treat boundaries as lines drawn in moments of frustration. The empath learned something different. They learned that boundaries are not reactions to harm. They are prevention systems designed to eliminate repetition of harm in the first place. This is a fundamental shift in psychology. Before this stage, the empath operates in a relational model built on adaptability. They adjust, they accommodate, they interpret, they soften. They are constantly calibrating themselves to maintain connection. But once they've gone through enough cycles of emotional imbalance, something inside them stops negotiating and starts filtering. And filtering is very different from accommodating. Filtering means the empath is no longer asking, "How do I make this work?" They are asking, "Does this deserve access to me at all?" That question alone changes everything. Because now every interaction is no longer emotionally immersive by default. It is evaluated, not through judgment, but through recognition. The empath begins to notice patterns faster. Inconsistency is no longer something they try to resolve, it is something they identify early and step away from before emotional investment deepens. This is where self-respect stops being an idea and becomes behavior. And behavior is what defines transformation, not intention. They no longer override discomfort just to preserve connection. They no longer delay their own needs in hopes that others will eventually notice them. They no longer stay in environments where clarity has to be constantly demanded instead of naturally given. And what's important to understand here is that this is not emotional withdrawal. It is emotional refinement, because the empath does not lose their capacity for connection. They refine where that capacity is directed. They become more precise with access. Their time is no longer freely distributed to confusion. Their attention is no longer automatically extended to inconsistency. Their emotional presence is no longer available as a default setting. It becomes conditional, not in a transactional sense, but in a respectful one. And that's where something interesting happens socially. People who were used to the empath's over-functioning begin to experience absence where presence used to be. But what they often interpret as rejection is actually the removal of compensation. The empath is no longer balancing emotional inequity in relationships that were never mutual in the first place. This is why the shift feels so noticeable, because the empath is no longer participating in dynamics that depended on their emotional excess. And in that absence, the truth of the relationship becomes visible. But internally, something even more important is happening. The empath is no longer deriving identity from how much they can endure. They are no longer measuring their worth by how much they can tolerate. They are no longer confusing emotional sacrifice with emotional value. Instead, they begin to anchor their identity in something more stable. Choice. Choice over who they engage with. Choice over what they tolerate. Choice over where they invest emotional energy. And once choice becomes the foundation, emotional chaos loses its influence, because chaos only controls systems that are unstructured. When structure is introduced, chaos becomes irrelevant. And that is what boundaries ultimately create, not separation from people, but protection of internal order. The empath is no longer emotionally accessible to dynamics that destabilize that order. And that is not punishment, it is preservation. This is where emotional intelligence matures into emotional authority. Not authority over others, but authority over self. They no longer need to announce their boundaries loudly because their behavior already enforces them. They no longer need to explain their limits repeatedly because those limits are already reflected in their choices. They no longer need validation for their decisions because their decisions are now internally aligned. And that alignment produces something very rare, emotional consistency. No more internal conflict between what they feel and what they tolerate. No more disconnect between their intuition and their behavior. No more self-abandonment in the name of connection. And from the outside, this looks like transformation. But from the inside, it feels like return. A return to self that was never fully protected before. So when people say they broke the empath, what they fail to understand is that breaking was never the final state. It was the transition point. What emerged afterward was not damage, it was definition. A clearer sense of who they are, what they will allow, and what they will never repeat again. And once that clarity is established, the empath doesn't go back to the version of themselves that confused endurance with love, because they've learned something irreversible. Not everyone deserves access to your depth. And once that truth becomes embodied, the way they move through the world changes forever, not louder, not colder, but unmistakably wiser.